The morning Alma Hurst nailed the first piece of paper to the old livery wall, 3 cowboys laughed at her from across the dusty street, and not a single one of them imagined she would still be standing there 6 months later, chalk on her hands and fire in her eyes. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Harlan Creek, Texas, sat like a dusty blister on the edge of the Llano Estacado, the kind of settlement that was always one dry summer away from becoming a ghost. The railroad had passed 30 miles to the north, so Harlan Creek had been left to fend for itself. A scatter of wood frame buildings, a general store run by a German immigrant named Brower, a saloon that never fully closed, a church that rarely opened, and somewhere between 500 and 600 souls depending on the season and the price of cattle. Alma had come to Harlan Creek 2 years before the school wall went up, following her husband Emmett, who had believed with his whole chest that a man could start fresh anywhere in Texas if he had a strong back and a willing heart. He had the strong back. He had the willing heart. What he did not have was enough time. A fever swept through the valley in the summer of 1876, the kind that moved fast and took indiscriminately, and Emmett Hurst was gone before the cottonwood leaves turned yellow. He left Alma with a modest claim, a small garden, a mule named August, and an absolute refusal to go back east and become someone's charity case. She was 31 years old when she nailed that paper to the wall. It said, in plain block letters she had written herself, "School. Free. All welcome. Mondays through Fridays. Sun up to noon." She had asked Brower for the building, and the old German had shrugged and said it was not doing anything useful since the previous tenant left owing him rent. She could have it on the condition she swept it clean every Saturday. She agreed without hesitation. The first week, 4 children came. The week after that, 7. By the end of the month, she had 16 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, and she had borrowed a slate board from a circuit preacher who passed through and felt guilty enough about the state of the town to leave something behind. She taught reading and arithmetic and a little geography. She taught the children how to write their names, which some of them had never done before. She told them stories about ancient Rome and about the mountains to the west and about why rivers bend the way they do. She did all of it for free because she believed, with a quiet and steady certainty, that a town without education was a town without a future. She was not a dramatic woman. She did not raise her voice unless it was necessary. She wore dark practical dresses and kept her brown hair pinned sensibly, and if she ever cried over Emmett, she did it alone, in the hours between dark and dawn when no one was watching. The people of Harlan Creek respected her the way they respected a good well, quietly, consistently, and mostly without expressing it aloud. Calvin Ralston rode into Harlan Creek on a Wednesday morning in late October of 1878, and he arrived the way trouble sometimes does, without announcing itself and without much fanfare. He came from the north on a gray horse named Drum, leading 2 pack horses loaded with supplies, and he looked like what he was, a working rancher who had been on the trail long enough that his coat was pale with dust, and his jaw was dark with several days of growth. He was 35 years old, wide in the shoulder, and had the kind of face that had started out pleasant and had been weathered into something more interesting by years of sun and wind and hard decisions. He had purchased a piece of land 8 miles southeast of town the previous winter through a land agent in Abilene, and had spent the past 8 months building a house and setting up fencing and establishing a herd of mixed longhorn cattle that he intended to drive north in the following spring. He had done all of this largely alone, with the help of 2 hired hands named Duro and Pete, who were reliable men but not great conversationalists. He came into town that Wednesday for supplies and to arrange an account with Brower, which he did efficiently and without much conversation. He was tying his horses at the rail outside the general store when he heard the sound coming from the old livery, a woman's voice, clear and unhurried, reading aloud from what sounded like a geography text. He stood still for a moment with one hand on Drum's neck, listening, because it was the last sound he expected to hear in a town like this. He did not go that day. He loaded his supplies and rode back to his land, but the sound stayed with him the way a particular piece of music sometimes does, and he found himself thinking about it in the evenings when the work was done and the lamp was burning low. The following Monday, he rode back into town. He had a legitimate reason. He needed to speak with the land agent about a boundary dispute with a neighboring property. But after he finished that errand, he walked slowly past the old livery and stopped. The door was propped open with a piece of split wood, and through the opening he could see 2 rows of children sitting on rough plank benches, and at the front of the room, standing beside a slate board, was Alma Hurst. She was writing something on the slate and explaining it as she wrote, and there was an ease to her movements that suggested she had been doing this a long time, though he learned later she had not been doing it very long at all. She had simply found the thing she was supposed to be doing, and she was doing it fully. She had a piece of chalk in her right hand, and she was talking about fractions of all things, breaking them down in a way that made them sound simple and logical, and a boy in the back row was nodding along with his mouth slightly open, the way people do when something clicks for the first time. Calvin stood in the doorway long enough that Alma turned and saw him. She did not startle. She gave him a calm, measuring look, the kind a schoolteacher gives someone standing in the entrance to a classroom, and said, "If you are here to learn, come in. If you are here for some other reason, please come back after noon." He almost turned around. He was not entirely sure why he did not. He stepped inside and sat down on the bench at the back, and the children around him stared, because grown men did not usually sit in the schoolroom, and he was a large man to be sharing a bench with a 10-year-old. But Alma simply turned back to her slate and went on explaining fractions, and he sat there and listened. He stayed until noon. When the children filed out, chattering and stomping, he remained seated, and Alma began erasing the slate board with a cloth, and she said without turning around, "You are Calvin Ralston. You bought the Hendricks claim southeast of town." "I did," he said. "You have been out there since spring without coming into town much." She turned then and looked at him with those clear, steady eyes that were darker than he had initially thought, a deep hazel that shifted toward green in the morning light. "What brings you to school, Mr. Ralston?" He was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands. "I never learned to read properly," he said. "I can figure numbers well enough, but reading—" He paused. "It was never taught to me." She looked at him for a long moment. A less direct woman might have looked away, might have let the silence soften the awkwardness of a grown man admitting such a thing. Alma Hurst simply nodded, as if he had told her the weather was turning and that was that. "Come back Thursday," she said. "The older children come then, and after them you can stay and we will work on it." He nodded, put his hat on, and walked out. He came back Thursday. He came back the following Monday, and the Thursday after that. Within 3 weeks he had a standing arrangement. He arrived after the older children's lessons, tied drum to the rail outside, and sat across a rough table from Alma Hurst while she showed him letters and sounds and words and the way they connected. She was patient in a way that did not feel like patience. It felt like she simply saw no reason to be otherwise. She never made him feel slow. She never raised an eyebrow when he stumbled. She just pointed to the word again and said it quietly and waited. He was not slow. He caught on quickly once the door was opened, and she told him so directly, which surprised him more than any difficulty would have. He had spent 35 years assuming something was broken in him because he could not read, and she dismantled that assumption in about 10 minutes. "You were never taught," she said, one afternoon when he made it through a full paragraph of a newspaper without stopping. "That is not the same as not being capable. They are entirely different things, Mr. Ralston." "You can call me Calvin," he said. She looked at him briefly. "All right," she said. "Calvin." The first time he heard her say his name without the formality attached to it, something shifted in his chest that he chose not to examine too closely. The children of Harlan Creek adored Alma with the unqualified devotion that children reserve for people who make them feel genuinely seen, and Calvin watched this from the sidelines during those weeks and thought he understood it. There was a boy named Thomas, about 9 years old, the son of a Mexican vaquero who worked for one of the larger ranch operations, and Thomas had a stutter that made the other children occasionally cruel. Alma worked with him privately, before and after school, and by November he could read a sentence aloud without stopping once. The look on his face when he did it was the kind of thing that made a man feel differently about the world. There was also a girl named Sarah, 12 years old, the daughter of a widow who took in laundry, and Sarah had a ferocious intelligence that had nowhere to go in a town that mostly believed girls needed to know how to bake and hem a dress. Alma gave her books, real books, ones she had brought from her life before Emmett died and before Texas, books about history and science and literature. She told Sarah in a matter-of-fact voice that being smart was not a problem, and that anyone who suggested otherwise was simply frightened. Calvin saw all of this. He watched it with the careful attention of a man who has spent most of his life watching things rather than talking about them. And what he saw was a woman who had built something real out of nothing, who had decided to pour herself into the service of a town that had not asked her to and had not offered to pay her, and who did it with a steadiness that he found more remarkable the more he understood what it cost her. Because it did cost her. He learned this gradually, as December settled in and the wind off the plains turned cold and bitter. Alma's claim was modest. The garden kept her in vegetables through the summer and into fall, but winter was harder. She had traded work with Brower, helping with his accounts, in exchange for flour and cornmeal and the occasional cut of meat. She had mended harness for 2 of the livery's clients in exchange for a cord of firewood. She did these things quietly, without complaining and without asking for help, and Calvin found out about them mostly by accident, from Brower one afternoon when he came in for supplies, and the old storekeeper mentioned offhandedly that Alma was coming to do the accounts that evening. "She does your books?" Calvin asked. Brower shrugged. "In exchange for credit on her account. She is a proud woman, that one. Will not take charity but will work for anything." Calvin did not say anything to this. He paid for his goods and rode home and sat by his fire that evening thinking about a woman who was teaching an entire town's children for free while quietly trading labor for food to keep herself warm through the winter. And he felt something that was more than admiration and less than anything he had words for yet. He started, the following week, bringing extra things when he came for lessons. Not gifts. He understood instinctively that direct gifts would be refused, but he found reasons. He had slaughtered a steer and had more meat than 2 men could eat, and it seemed wasteful not to bring some when he was riding to town anyway. He had found a supply of good hardwood on his property and cut more than he needed for his own hearth. He left 2 cords behind the school. He brought coffee once, because Brower had mentioned she had been out for a week and was using chicory, which was terrible. And when Alma looked at the wrapped packet he set on the table, she pressed her lips together and looked at him with those serious hazel eyes. "You are being kind," she said. "I am being practical," he said. "My coffee comes in a larger bag than 1 man can use before it goes stale." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Calvin." She poured them both a cup using the small cast iron pot she kept on the school stove, and they sat across from each other, and he practiced reading while it snowed outside, the first real snow of the winter sifting down over Harlan Creek in pale, unhurried curtains. And it was, though neither of them said so, a very good afternoon. He had been coming for lessons for about 2 months when the trouble started. It came in the form of a man named Gerald Sutter, who was not from Harlan Creek originally, but had set himself up in town as a property broker, and had recently begun making it known that he had an interest in the building Alma used for the school. Brower, it emerged, had debts, as many small businessmen in frontier towns did, and Sutter had quietly acquired some of those debts, which gave him leverage over the German storekeeper, and by extension, over the building he had so generously leaned to the schoolteacher. Alma heard about this from Sarah's mother, who heard it from the wife of one of the saloon's regular patrons. which was the telegraph system by which most significant information moved through Harlan Creek. She sat with it for an evening and then went to see Brower, who confirmed it with great embarrassment and genuine distress. He was sorry, he said. He had not meant for this to happen. Sutter had said he wanted to use the building for a freight storage business, and there was nothing Brower could do. The papers were signed. Alma thanked him for telling her and walked home in the cold with her hands in her coat pockets and her face very still. She told Calvin about it on Thursday, because he was sitting across the table from her, and she had just read him a passage about the rights of citizens, and he had made a comment about the distance between law on paper and law in practice, and the Sutter business felt relevant. She did not tell him in a way that asked for help. She told him the way she told him most things, straightforwardly, without decoration, as one adult informs another about a situation of shared interest. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "What does Sutter want actually, with the building?" "Storage," he says. "And what does he actually want?" She looked at him. "I am not certain. But he has spoken to Mrs. Carvey about opening a commercial laundry, and Mrs. Carvey has spoken to half the town about it, so I suspect the storage story is not the whole story. He wants to rent it out at a profit. That would be my guess." Calvin was quiet again, turning his pen over in his fingers. He had taken to using a pen during their lessons, practicing his letters with a careful attention that she found quietly affecting. "How much does Brower owe?" he asked. "I do not know exactly. Enough that Sutter was able to acquire a controlling interest." He nodded. He looked at the table. Then he said, "Could you find another building?" It was the wrong question. She had already been through it in her mind, and she saw from the slight shift in his expression that he realized it as he said it. There were not many buildings in Harlan Creek not already in use, and the ones that were empty were either structurally unsound or owned by men who had no interest in lending them to a schoolteacher for nothing. "I will find a way," she said, and the way she said it, not defiantly, not dramatically, but simply, as a statement of fact about her own capacity, made something tighten in Calvin's throat. He did not say anything else about it that day. That evening, he rode to see a man named Turner, who owned several properties in town and who was known to be reasonable. He sat with Turner in his front room and drank whiskey he did not want and talked about property for 20 minutes, feeling his way toward a solution, and by the end of the conversation he had identified something that might work. Turner had a building on the east side of town, formerly a barber and dentist's operation, that had been empty for 4 months. It was smaller than the livery space, but it was sound and had good windows and a workable stove. The following day he went to see Sutter. Gerald Sutter was a man in his middle 40s, with the kind of surface friendliness that is constructed very deliberately to conceal a transactional nature. He met Calvin in his office, a rented room in the back of the saloon, and offered him a drink and a chair and a pleasant expression, and Calvin took the chair, declined the drink, and got to the point. "The school building," Calvin said. "I understand you have an interest in it." Sutter spread his hands in a gesture of philosophical acceptance. "Business is business, Mr. Ralston. I have a legitimate use for the space." "I am sure you do," Calvin said. "I am also interested in a piece of property you own on the edge of town, the fenced lot near the creek, the one with the old windmill." Sutter's expression shifted slightly, calculating. "That is not currently for sale." "Everything is for sale," Calvin said, in the same easy, measured tone that Sutter had used, and watched the man smile with a bit more genuine pleasure. They talked for a while. Calvin was not a man who had spent time in negotiation rooms, but he had dealt with cattle buyers and land agents, and the particular mathematics of a deal where both sides needed to feel they had won something. He left Sutter's office an hour later, having agreed to purchase the creek lot at a price that was slightly too high but not unreasonable, in exchange for Sutter identifying himself as satisfied with the arrangement and releasing his claim on the livery building, which Brower's debt would be quietly settled by a third party before Sutter changed his mind. The third party was Calvin himself. He went to Brower that afternoon and paid the debt, and the old German stared at him and then said, "Why are you doing this?" Calvin put his hat on. "The school needs a building," he said. He did not tell Alma any of this. He came back Thursday for his lesson, and she read with him from the newspaper. He was working his way through real text now, articles and editorials, stumbling occasionally but with increasing fluency. And at the end of the afternoon she said casually that Brower had told her the debt situation with Sutter had resolved itself. Calvin said, "Is that right?" She looked at him for a long moment. She was not a woman who was easily fooled, and he could see her putting pieces together, and he watched the moment she arrived at the right conclusion, because her expression changed in a way that was small but unmistakable, a softening, quickly controlled. "You," she said, "not a question." "The creek lot has good grass," he said. "It was worth buying." She was quiet. She looked at her hands on the table and then she looked at him and she said with a directness that cut straight through him, "Thank you, Calvin, for the children, for Thomas and Sarah and all of them." He looked back at her. "I was protecting my reading teacher," he said. "My motives are entirely selfish." She laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, a real laugh, brief and unguarded, the kind that slips out before a person decides to allow it. And it changed her face so completely that he sat very still for a moment, the way a man does when something beautiful surprises him. December became January. The snow was heavy that year on the Llano Estacado, the kind of winter that settled in earnest and kept cattle pinned against fence lines, and filled the water tanks and made the mornings a blue, still silence that was almost too beautiful to bear. Calvin rode to town through it twice a week, every week, and he sat across from Alma and Reed while the stove ticked and the wind moved against the walls, and they talked. They talked about everything. He told her about the ranch, the problems and the small victories, the steer he had pulled from a ditch that morning, the question of whether to expand the herd before the spring drive or wait another season. She told him about the children and about Emmett, gradually and carefully, the way you share a thing that you have held private for a long time. She told him about her life before Texas. She was originally from Ohio, had come west with Emmett after they married, had loved the plains with a feeling that surprised her because nothing in her Ohio upbringing had prepared her for the way the sky looked out here, enormous and honest, and without any of the comfortable green clutter of the East. "Do you miss Ohio?" he asked once. "No," she said without hesitation. "This is my place. It took losing Emmett to understand it, but this is my place." He understood that because he had felt the same thing about this particular stretch of Texas land, that it had chosen him as much as he had chosen it. He came from Kansas originally, had worked ranches through his 20s, had tried 3 different states before riding down into the Llano and feeling for the first time that he had arrived somewhere. "My father could not read either," he told her one afternoon, in the candid way that their conversations had gradually made possible. "Nor my mother. It was not seen as important where I grew up. You worked the land. You kept your accounts in your head, or you found someone to trust with a pen." "And did you trust anyone with a pen?" she asked. "I trusted the wrong person once," he said. "It cost me a year's work." She looked at him steadily. "That will not happen again." "No," he agreed. "It will not." There was a man in Harlan Creek named Holt who had been watching Alma with an interest that several people in town had noticed and that Alma herself had chosen not to engage with. Holt was a horse trader, not an unpleasant man, but an insistent one, and he had decided sometime in the fall that Alma Hurst's widowhood had gone on long enough and that he was the appropriate remedy. He made his intentions known in the way frontier men sometimes did, not through any direct declaration, but through a persistent presence, showing up when she was at Brower's store, walking alongside her, offering to carry things she did not need carried, talking in a loud proprietary voice about her school as if he had some investment in it. Alma handled him with a cool politeness that told him nothing and gave him nothing, but he was the kind of man who took silence as encouragement. One Thursday afternoon in late January, Alma and Calvin were in the middle of a lesson when Holt came through the open door of the school, with the confidence of a man who has decided he belongs somewhere. He stopped when he saw Calvin and did not hide his assessment of the situation or his displeasure. "Ralston," he said, in a voice that was just short of rude. "Holt," Calvin replied in a voice that was entirely civil. Holt looked at Alma. "I came to ask if you would join me for supper at the hotel this Saturday. They have a new cook and the food is supposed to be worth eating." Alma put her chalk down on the table very calmly. "That is kind of you, Mr. Holt. I will be busy on Saturday." "You are always busy," Holt said, and there was something in it that was not quite an accusation but was edging toward one. "I am," she agreed pleasantly. "I have a great deal to do." Holt looked at Calvin again and then back at Alma, and his jaw tightened in a way that suggested he was doing arithmetic about the situation. "I see," he said. He put his hat back on, though he had not technically taken it off. "Good day, then." He left. Alma turned back to the table and picked up her chalk as if nothing had happened. She said, "Where were we?" Calvin watched her for a moment. "We were at the paragraph about the Reconstruction Acts," he said, "but we can come back to it." She looked up. "Can we? Are you all right?" "I am perfectly fine," she said, and it was clearly true because she did not look rattled or distressed. She looked the way she always looked, composed and direct in herself. "That man has been a persistent inconvenience for some time. He is not dangerous, merely single-minded. I could speak to him if—" "No," she said, with a quiet firmness that stopped him immediately. "I am not a woman who needs someone to speak on her behalf about such things, Calvin. I am capable of managing my own situation." "I know that," he said. "Good." She pointed to the newspaper, the paragraph about the Reconstruction Acts. He found the paragraph. He read it. His reading was genuinely good now. Not polished, not literary, but functional and capable, and occasionally more than that. He had read a whole chapter of a history book that Alma had lent him, about the Civil War and its causes, and had come back the following Thursday with questions that had kept them talking past their usual ending time, the afternoon fading outside while they sat by the stove and argued gently about the nature of justice and whether history was something that could be corrected or only mourned. He was in love with her. He had been aware of this for some weeks in a way that felt more like a fact about the landscape than a revelation. It was simply true, the way the wind was true and the cold was true, a condition of the territory he now inhabited. He had not said anything because she had not given him any clear indication that such information would be welcome, and he was not a man who forced things. He believed in patience the way he believed in good weather coming after bad, not as a guarantee, but as a reasonable probability if you waited long enough. February came, and with it, a particular afternoon that he replayed in his mind for years afterward. The school had let out early because a sandstorm was building from the southwest, the kind that came up fast and turned the afternoon into a brown, howling confusion that drove people indoors and kept them there. Most of the children had been collected by parents or sent off in groups. Alma was closing the shutters when Calvin came back from Brower's with his supplies to find her struggling with a shutter that had come loose from its hinge and was banging in the rising wind. He climbed up on the outside ledge and held the shutter while she worked the hinge back into its pin, and they were very close in that moment, close enough that he could see the color in her cheeks from the cold and the effort, and her hair had come partly loose from its pins in the wind and was moving around her face. She got the hinge back in, and she looked up to tell him so and found him looking at her. Neither of them moved for a moment. The wind was very loud. She was the one who spoke first. She said quietly, barely audible over the storm, "You are always here when something needs doing." "I am trying to be useful," he said. His voice came out lower than he intended. "You are more than useful," she said, and it was said simply, without coyness, the way she said everything, and it was more devastating for that simplicity than anything elaborate could have been. He came down from the ledge. The storm was fully on them now, the air thick with grit and noise, and she said he should not try to ride back to the ranch in this weather, and he agreed, though he suspected he would have agreed to whatever she said at that particular moment. They went inside, and she made coffee, and they sat by the stove while the storm worked itself against the building, and they talked for 3 hours without a pause, and somewhere in those 3 hours, something was settled between them that had nothing to do with words. It was settled the way things are settled in quiet, not announced, not decided, but understood by both parties and held carefully, the way you hold something fragile while you work out where it should go. He kissed her on the doorstep when the storm broke, just as the air was clearing, and the late afternoon light came through the brown haze in long golden shafts. He did it gently and with full honesty, no performance, no strategy, just the direct expression of what he felt, which was that she was the most extraordinary person he had ever been in a room with, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. She kissed him back. That was the clearest, most important thing that had ever happened to him. When he pulled back, she looked at him with those honest hazel eyes and said, "I want to be straightforward with you." "Please," he said. "I am not looking for someone to take care of me," she said. "I have taken care of myself for 2 years, and I intend to go on doing so. I am not the kind of woman who stops being herself because she is in love." The word landed between them. "In love," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Yes." He felt the whole wide sky of Texas in his chest. "I would not want you to stop being yourself," he said. "I fell in love with who you are." She nodded. She pressed her lips together briefly. Then she said, "All right, then." He rode home through the settling dust of the storm with the blood moving fast through his whole body and a feeling he had no name for, enormous and simple and completely new. March came in on warm winds from the south, and with it a new complication. Word had come down from a settlement further north that a land speculator named Vance Cross was moving through the region, buying up properties at low prices from settlers who were struggling through the difficult winter, and selling them at considerably higher prices to Eastern investors who wanted Texas land without the inconvenience of Texas. Cross operated within the technical limits of the law. He was not dishonest exactly, but he was aggressive and skilled at identifying vulnerability and applying pressure to it. Cross arrived in Harlan Creek in the first week of March, and within 2 days he had approached 5 landowners about selling, and within 3 he had approached Alma. She was at Brower's store when he found her. He was a trim, well-dressed man in his 50s, not physically intimidating but with the manner of someone accustomed to being listened to, and he made his pitch smoothly and without waste. The Alma Hurst claim was not particularly productive land. The widow's situation was challenging. He had a buyer who would pay a fair price, and she would be better served by the capital than by the land. He said all of this as if it were reasonable and kind. Alma listened to the whole thing. Then she said, "No, thank you." He looked at her the way men in his business look at people who have not yet understood the situation. "Mrs. Hurst, the land is not generating income." "In time, Mr. Cross," she said, in the same quiet voice she used to tell children that the answer was wrong and they should try again. "My land is not for sale. It was my husband's and it is mine and it is going to remain mine. I appreciate your interest, but the answer is no." He tried twice more, at different times, on different days, and she said no both times, politely and without any drama. And then she told Calvin about it one afternoon in the school when the children had gone. He listened the way he had listened to the Sutter business, fully, without interrupting, and then with a quiet and particular stillness that she was beginning to recognize as his version of intensity. "He has been to others," he said. "I know, several families. A few have agreed to sell." She said it with a slight weight in her voice because it was a kind of grief watching people leave land they had worked for. "What does he want with your claim specifically?" "I have the creek," she said. "Or rather, my land has access to the creek. Most of the surrounding claims do not, or have only seasonal access. Someone buying my land would control the water for a significant piece of this valley." Calvin was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "That is not a simple piece of information." "No," she said. "If you needed to protect the land," he said carefully, There are legal ways to do it. You could form a water use agreement with the neighboring claims, something formal and recorded at the county seat. It would make the land harder to use for the purpose Cross likely intends and might reduce his interest in it. She looked at him. You have been thinking about this. I have been reading the land law section of the legal reference that Turner has in his office, he said, with a matter-of-fact directness that made her smile. It took me 3 evenings, and I do not say I understand all of it, but I understand the relevant parts. She looked at him steadily, and there was something in her eyes that moved past the careful composure she usually maintained, something warm and unguarded. 3 evenings of legal text, she said. You taught me to read, he said simply. I might as well use it. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, briefly, and the warmth of it was more important than any embrace would have been. They went to the county seat together, riding in Alma's wagon with August the mule doing his slow and dignified work at the front. It was a 2-day ride, and they stayed at different establishments, as was proper, and spent the evenings talking over supper at a roadside inn. And Calvin thought that this was, without question, the best 2 days he had spent in his adult life. At the county seat, with the help of a patient county clerk and the land law reference they had brought from Turner, they registered a formal water use agreement signed by Alma and 4 neighboring landowners who were glad enough to have the protection. Cross's agent, who was in the county seat at the same time for reasons of his own, saw them leaving the clerk's office and made a visible calculation on his face and did not approach them. On the way home, riding through the broad grass plains in the afternoon light, with the sky doing its enormous and generous Texas thing above them, Alma said, "You do not have to keep doing this." "Doing what?" he asked. "Protecting me, solving things. I have managed, I know you have managed," he said, "and you would go on managing. That is not why I do it." She looked at him, the reins loose in her hands, the wagon rocking gently on the rutted road. Then why? He had been thinking about how to say this for some time. He chose the simplest version because it was also the truest. "Because I love you," he said. "And because what you are doing, the school, those children, Thomas and Sarah, and all of them matters. It matters in a way that most things out here do not. I want it to survive. I want you to survive. Not because you cannot survive without me, but because I would like to be part of it." She looked at the road ahead for a long moment. The grass moved in the wind, and August flicked his ears, and the late light made everything gold and blue. "I would like that too," she said. He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the seat between them, and she let him hold it, and they rode the rest of the way home like that, in a comfortable and complete silence. Spring came fully in April, and Calvin drove his cattle north for the spring market with Duro and Pete, while Alma finished the school year and made plans for the summer and fall. They were not yet formally engaged. It had not been discussed in those terms yet, but the shape of the thing was clear to both of them and to most of Harlan Creek, which had opinions about it in the way small towns have opinions about everything. Holt had retreated, finally and permanently, after Calvin's return from the cattle drive in May, when he arrived back in Harlan Creek with enough from the market to pay his hands and cover his debts and still have something substantial left. And when he rode straight to the school without stopping at the ranch first, and Alma came out the door and he said hello in the way that meant something large and private, and the watching town drew its own conclusions. The summer between the first school year and the second was its own story. Calvin's ranch was taking proper shape. The house was finished and solid, the herd was healthy, and he had begun to think about what the property might look like in 5 years, in 10. And in those thoughts Alma was always there, central and real, not as an addition to a life he had already built, but as the whole reason the future had a shape at all. He asked her to marry him in June at the school, after the last day of the first full school year. He did it with no ceremony and no flourish because that was not who either of them was. He simply said, when the last child had gone and they were sweeping the floor together, "Alma, I want to marry you. I want you to know that is what I want, and I want to know what you want." She leaned on her broom and looked at him, Outside, the summer was full and hot and smelled of grass and cedar. "I want to keep the school," she said. "Of course," he said. "I want to keep my land. I would not fold it into yours without a formal agreement that protects my claim." "I expected nothing less," he said. "We can draw up whatever you want. Turner knows a lawyer in Abilene." "I want to keep teaching for free," she said, "even after we are married, even if the ranch does well and we do not need the income. The children in this town need it for free or they do not have it." "I know," he said. She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "Yes," she said. He set the broom down and crossed the room to her and held her face in both his hands and kissed her with everything he had, which was considerable, and she held his coat in her fists and kissed him back. They were married in September of 1879 at the Harlan Creek church on a Sunday afternoon, with a congregation of nearly 200 people who turned out, because Alma was one of the people the town loved the way it loved good water quietly, essentially, with a depth of feeling it had not always been able to articulate. Even the circuit preacher came through at the right time, which felt like a sign to those inclined to read signs. Sarah, the 12-year-old who loved books, stood at the front and read a passage that Alma had chosen, from a poem about the endurance of things, and her voice was steady and clear and perfect. Thomas, the boy who had once struggled with every word, read the opening verse of the ceremony, and he did not stutter once. Calvin stood at the front of the church in the best clothes he owned, which he had ordered from a catalog with Alma's quiet guidance. And when she came down the aisle in a dark blue dress she had made herself, with her hair down in a way he had never seen it, he pressed his jaw together hard and kept his face steady through pure strength of will, because he was not a man who cried in public, but it was close. The reception was held in the schoolroom, because Alma said it was the right place for it, and people brought food and someone brought a fiddle and someone else brought a banjo, and the dancing went on until the stars were out thick over Harlan Creek, and the children were asleep in corners, and the lanterns were burning low. Calvin danced with his wife. That was a word he turned over in his mind, tasting its newness, and found it was the best word he had ever encountered. And she danced with a straight-backed grace that he had not known about before tonight, and she laughed twice while they danced, and each time it was the laugh that slipped out before she decided to allow it, and each time it was the best sound in the territory. That winter, the second year of the school, Alma expanded the curriculum. She arranged for a retired surveyor to come and teach the older children about land measurement and basic engineering. She wrote a letter to a publisher in Austin asking about the possibility of acquiring donated textbooks, and she received, to her genuine surprise, a crate of 20 books by February. She began holding a second session in the evenings twice a week, for adults who wanted to learn reading or numbers or both, and the first evening drew 9 people, which she considered a triumph. Calvin continued to come to the school, not for lessons now. His reading was solid and good, and he had moved on to reading on his own, had worked through 3 history books and a collection of essays by the end of winter. But to help with the evening sessions, where he proved surprisingly effective with the older men who were embarrassed about their lack of reading, because he could speak to it from personal experience without any trace of condescension. There was something profound, Alma thought, watching him from across the room, about the way he had turned his own vulnerability into a bridge for others. He had come to her school reluctant and cautious, had sat on a child's bench with his hat in his hands, and had admitted something that many men in his position would have died rather than admit, and in doing so had made himself more rather than less. In the spring of 1880, Alma discovered she was expecting their first child. She told Calvin on a Tuesday evening with the same directness with which she told him everything, and he sat very still for a moment and then said, in a voice that was not quite steady, "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. He pulled her into his arms in the middle of the kitchen, right there, and held her for a long time without saying anything, and she could feel his heart going fast under her ear, and she thought, not for the first time, that the still exterior of this man covered a depth of feeling that he had spent his whole life learning to manage, and that she was among the very few people who had been trusted to see it. "I want you to keep doing everything you do," he said into her hair. "The school, all of it. Only if you are well enough, only if you want to." "I want to," she said. "I am not made of glass." "I know you are not," he said. "That is why I married you." The baby came in November of 1880. A boy, born healthy and loud on a cold night with the midwife from 2 homesteads over and Calvin in the next room moving back and forth with the restless energy of a man who cannot do anything useful and knows it. They named him James, after no one in particular but with a weight behind it that felt like a starting point rather than an ending. James Emmett Ralston, because Alma wanted Emmett in there, and Calvin agreed without hesitation, because he understood that honoring the dead was not a failure to embrace the living. Calvin held his son for the first time on a gray November morning with the wind off the plains and the baby making the small, improbable sounds of new things, and his face was very composed for about 10 seconds, and then it was not composed at all, and Alma watched it happen and said nothing, because some moments are better observed than commented upon. James grew fast and well. He was a curious child from the beginning, the kind who reached for everything and stared at nothing for long, thinking periods that suggested a serious interior life. By the time he was old enough to sit in the schoolroom, he was already asking questions that the older children had not yet thought to ask, and Alma taught him with the same careful attention she gave everyone, with the additional complexity of loving him so completely that she sometimes had to remind herself to let him struggle with things before she helped. The school continued to grow. By 1881, Alma had over 30 students in the day sessions and a consistent attendance of a dozen adults in the evening sessions. She had trained a young woman named Margaret, the daughter of a local farmer, to help with the younger children, and Margaret had turned out to be a natural teacher herself, patient and inventive and genuinely interested in the children as people. Alma felt a particular pride in this. She was not just teaching children, she was producing a second generation of teachers. The ranch was doing well. Calvin had expanded the herd carefully, not recklessly, and had developed a reputation in the region as a man who dealt fairly and delivered what he promised, which was worth more in the cattle business than almost anything else. He hired a third hand, a young Mexican man named Rafael who had come north from below the Rio Grande looking for honest work and had found it on the Ralston claim. Calvin paid fair wages and did not ask anyone to do work he would not do himself, and the ranch ran smoothly and without the turnover that plagued operations where men felt used. He read constantly now. It was one of the great surprises of his middle life. That reading, which had been a closed door for 35 years, had turned out to be a country in itself, vast and various and inexhaustible. He read history and geography and occasionally newspapers, and once, to Alma's particular delight, he read a novel, a long one, about sea voyages and adventure, and came in from a day's riding and sat down to it the way another man might sit down to supper. She did not say anything about it. She just noticed, and held the noticing quietly, and loved him for it. In 1882, a question arose that had been hovering at the edge of their lives for some time. Cross had moved on from Harlan Creek, his ambitions frustrated by the water agreement and by the stubbornness of enough landowners to make his project unprofitable. But the larger question, the consolidation of land in the region, the pressure on small claims, the railroad company's growing hunger for right-of-way, was not going away. A meeting was called in Harlan Creek to discuss the formation of a local landowners association, something formal that could present a unified voice to outside interests. Alma and Calvin both attended. Calvin spoke at the meeting, which surprised some people who had taken his quietness for passivity, and what he said was clear and methodical, and grounded in the land law he had read over the winter, and the meeting ended with a resolution to form the association and to meet quarterly to compare information and make collective decisions. He was elected chairman, mostly because no one else wanted the job, but partly because people trusted the man who had gone to the county seat with the widowed schoolteacher and helped her protect her water rights before anyone else had thought to do the same. Alma sat in the back of the room and watched her husband at the front, standing easily in the way he had always stood, wide-shouldered and unhurried, and she thought about the man who had come through her school door with his hat in his hands 2 years before this, and the difference between that man and this one was not that he had changed his character. He had not. The essential thing was the same, but that he had been given the room to be fully himself, and he was. She believed in that. She had believed in it with every child who had passed through her door, that the capacity was always there, waiting for the right conditions. She believed in it for herself, too, in the years since Emmett, in the building of something from nothing, in the proving that she was more than half of what she had been. She was more than that. She had always been more than that. She just needed enough time and enough clear air to find out. James had a brother in 1883, a second boy they named Henry, and then 2 years after that a girl, their third child and last, named Clara. The Ralston household on the edge of Harlan Creek. They had built a proper house by then, on the ranch land but close enough to town that Alma could drive the wagon in for school days without difficulty, was a particular kind of full. Not the loud chaos of a household at odds with itself, but the warm, productive busyness of people who have enough to do and enough love to make the doing meaningful. James was 5 when Henry was born, and immediately appointed himself protector and authority, a role he took with great seriousness, and Henry tolerated with the philosophical good nature of a middle child born into a world where the roles are already cast. Clara, when she arrived, was the person who disrupted all existing arrangements and made them better, the way the third child sometimes does. She was fierce and funny and utterly uninterested in anyone else's plan for her, which her mother recognized immediately, and her father regarded with a particular, helpless pride. The school continued, through all of it. Alma taught through her pregnancies and returned to teaching after each child with the calm determination of someone for whom a purpose is not optional. The school grew into a 2-room operation when Harlan Creek's population expanded in the early 1880s, and a second teacher, not Margaret, who had married a farmer in the next county and started a school of her own, but a young man named Charles, fresh from a teacher's college in Fort Worth, who had the enthusiasm of someone new to the work and benefited considerably from Alma's steady, experienced guidance. The town of Harlan Creek changed in those years. The railroad came, finally, in 1884, not all the way to town but close enough that a spur line was proposed, and with it came the particular changes that followed the railroad. More people, more commerce, more dispute, more ambition. Some of it was good. Some of it brought the injustices that came with rapid growth and with the particular dynamics of the frontier, where power was often in the hands of whoever had arrived most recently with the most money and the least compunction. The Landowners' Association that Calvin chaired held its own against several of these pressures, not always winning but always being present, always documented, always ready to argue its case in the county records, and when necessary in the county court. Calvin developed a relationship with a lawyer in Abilene named Davis who was fair-minded and sharp and willing to work with frontier settlers at rates that acknowledged the reality of their finances. Davis drove out twice a year and met with the association, and the association grew to include ranchers from 3 surrounding counties, and the collective weight of it made individual members harder to push around. Calvin and Davis developed a genuine friendship, which surprised both of them. They were different kinds of men, from different worlds, but they had in common the habit of reading, which had given Calvin an access to Davis's world that neither of them had expected when they first met. They argued about the law the way that Calvin and Alma argued about history, with conviction and without hostility, each one genuinely interested in the other's position. Davis came to the school one autumn and talked to the older students about the law and how it worked, and what it meant to live in a country where the law was, in principle, the protection of the weak against the strong. He was a good speaker, not a brilliant one but honest, and the children listened. Sarah, no longer 12 but 17 now, with clear, intelligent eyes and that same ferocious hunger for knowledge, asked questions that made Davis pause and think before answering, which was the best kind of question. Sarah went to Fort Worth the following year to pursue further education, one of the first young women from Harlan Creek to do so. She came back 2 years later, qualified as a teacher, and opened a school in a neighboring settlement that had none. She wrote to Alma about it, a long letter in a hand that was clear and assured, and Alma read it at the kitchen table with Calvin sitting across from her and James doing his arithmetic on the other end of the bench, and her eyes filled without her deciding to allow it, which was the other kind of slipping out. "Sarah?" Calvin asked. "She has started a school," Alma said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "That is yours, you know." "It is hers," Alma said. "Yes," he agreed. "And it is yours too." She put the letter down and looked at her husband across the table, this man who had walked into her school with his hat in his hands because he wanted to learn something, and who had stayed because of something else entirely, and who had become, in the years between then and now, the most fully known person in her life. She knew the way he moved through the house in the early morning when he thought everyone was asleep. She knew the particular set of his shoulders when he was worried about something, and choosing not to say so yet. She knew that he read in the evenings with a lamp pulled close, and that he occasionally laughed at things he read, and that he was slightly embarrassed about laughing at things he read. She knew the way he looked at their children, which was the same way he looked at the land, with a quiet and tremendous care that was the best thing she had ever been trusted to witness. "Come here," she said. He looked up from across the table. "Come here, Calvin." He got up and came around the table, and she stood, and he put his arms around her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder, right there in the kitchen with James looking up from his arithmetic with the pragmatic 7-year-old's acceptance of whatever adults do. And she held on to the man she had married and felt, with a completeness that she had not expected to feel again after the years of managing and enduring, entirely well. By 1886, James was 5 and Henry was 3 and Clara was nearly 1, and the Ralston house was the kind of household that people came to for things, for advice, for arbitration, for the use of Alma's books, for the steadiness of Calvin's judgment. The school had become the defining institution of Harlan Creek. When the railroad spur finally came, and the town grew and new families arrived with children who needed educating, the first thing they did was come to Alma's school, and the school took them in, as it always had, for free. There were debates in the town about whether to formalize the school to petition the county for public funding, which was becoming possible as Texas built out its public education infrastructure. Alma supported this, argued for it at community meetings, and worked with Davis to file the appropriate paperwork. It took 3 years and 2 legislative sessions and more correspondence than she liked to count, but in 1887, the Harlan Creek School was recognized as a public institution and received county funding for the first time, which meant a proper building, not the old livery which had served them for nearly a decade, but a real schoolhouse, built with proper lumber, with windows on 3 sides and a bell tower. Though the bell itself was a community donation from 12 families, who each gave what they could. On the day the schoolhouse opened, Alma stood in the doorway and looked at the room, the rows of desks, which were actual desks, not planks on sawhorses, the slate board at the front, the books on shelves along the wall, and she was very quiet for a long time. Calvin came up behind her. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. He put his hands on her shoulders, and she put one of her hands over his, and they stood there in the new schoolroom doorway while James ran past them and climbed up on a desk, and Henry climbed up after him. And Clara, who Calvin was holding in one arm, reached toward the light coming through the windows with the total and uncomplicated ambition of a very young child. "What do you think Emmett would say?" Calvin asked. It was not a complicated question the way it might have been from another man. He had never been threatened by Emmett because he understood that the dead are not rivals, they are part of the architecture of the person you love, and you respect the architecture. Alma considered the question honestly. "He would say I should have done it sooner," she said. "He was never very patient." Calvin smiled. "That tracks from what you have told me." She turned to look at him. "He would also have liked you," she said. "He liked men who meant what they said." Calvin held her gaze. "I mean what I say." "I know," she said. "That is why I let you in." He bent and kissed her temple, right there in the doorway of the new schoolhouse with their children climbing on the furniture, and she tipped her head slightly toward him. And for a moment the whole room was very still and very golden with the morning light, and everything that had happened. The fever and the loss and the years of managing, and the cold winters and the Sutters, and the crosses of the world and the chalk dust, and the patient afternoons across the lesson table, and the sandstorm and the doorstep kiss, and the wedding and the years after, all of it was present in that moment, and made sense in the way that things make sense only in retrospect, when you can see the whole shape. James was 7 in 1887, Henry was 4, and Clara had just turned 2 with the loud and determined celebration of someone who considers birthdays a personal achievement. James was in his mother's school by then, sitting in the front row because he had asked to sit in the front row, which the other students found annoying, and which Alma privately found wonderful, though she treated him with the same matter-of-fact expectations she applied to every other child. James could read. He had been reading since he was 5, taught partly by his mother and partly by picking up every piece of text in the house and working his way through it. And he was beginning to show a particular talent for mathematics, the numbers sliding together in his mind with a speed and ease that suggested his father's facility with figures expressed through a different medium. Henry was quieter, more observant, less inclined to announce himself. He followed Calvin around the ranch with a dedicated seriousness, learning the names of the cattle and the ways of the horses and the logic of the fences, and Calvin taught him with the same patience that Alma had showed Calvin himself, which was not a coincidence. Calvin had thought about this, had understood that patience was what had changed his life, and he had made a decision about the kind of father he would be. Raphael, the hand who had been with them since 1881, had built a small house on the eastern edge of the claim and brought his wife up from below the Rio Grande, a woman named Lucinda who was quiet and capable, and who became, gradually, one of Alma's closest friends in the particular way that women on the frontier form friendships, through the practical intimacy of shared labor and mutual reliance. Lucinda helped with Clara sometimes when the school demands were heavy, and Alma helped Lucinda with the correspondence she needed to send to her family further south, and they drank coffee together on Alma's porch in the evenings, when both their husbands were occupied, and talked about things that they did not talk about in front of anyone else. Calvin and Raphael had a similar friendship, built on the specific trust of men who work land together and understand each other's intentions, and it ran underneath the formal structure of employer and employee without eliminating that structure, which made it more rather than less honest. The ranch grew steadily through the late 1880s. Not explosively. Calvin was a careful man, and the cattle market was volatile enough to caution against overextension, but solidly, in the way that good land managed by attentive people grows. By 1888, they had 300 head of quality cattle, a small breeding operation that was developing a reputation for good stock, and enough income to maintain the house well and educate the children and still put something aside. The Landowners Association continued its work, and Calvin continued to chair it, and the accumulation of that work, the small legal victories, the documentation of rights, the quarterly conversations that kept neighbors informed about each other's situations, had a cumulative effect on the valley that was hard to measure in any single moment but was unmistakable across years. Several families who might have sold and left under different circumstances stayed because they knew they were not alone. Children who might have grown up without any formal learning grew up with Alma's school behind them. The valley was not a paradise, no frontier settlement was, but it was something, and the something had been built by specific people making specific decisions, and Alma and Calvin were among the most specific. In the autumn of 1888, on the occasion of their 9th wedding anniversary, Calvin gave Alma a present. It was a book, not a borrowed one, not a found one, but one he had ordered specifically. A natural history of the Texas plains written by a professor at a university in Austin, illustrated with careful drawings of the plants and animals and geological features of the region. He had written inside the cover in the handwriting that was his own now, grown from those early careful practice letters into something that bore his particular character. For Alma, who taught me to read and then let me stay. With all of my love, Calvin. She read the inscription twice. Then she looked up at him. With all of your love, she said. Every bit of it, he confirmed. She closed the book and held it against her chest for a moment and looked at him with those hazel eyes that he had been reading with increasing fluency for 9 years. You are going to make me cry, she said. I know, he said, without apology. She did cry briefly and without fuss, and then she wiped her eyes with the practical efficiency of a woman who does not indulge herself for long, and she kissed him, and then she said, James has been hiding in the barn with Henry for the past hour and I need to know why. He laughed. I will go look. He went and found his sons in the hayloft with a very small and loudly unhappy kitten they had discovered in the yard, and he sat with them for a while they explained the kitten's situation at length, and he listened to all of it. And then he helped them bring the kitten inside and argued Alma into allowing it to stay on the porch. And the evening concluded with all 5 of them at the dinner table, and the kitten on the porch and Clara falling asleep in her chair before the plates were cleared. This was ordinary life. This was what it was. Not a dramatic or spectacular thing most days, but a full thing textured and specific and built of real material. Alma had understood this, had built the school on this premise, that ordinary people in an ordinary place deserved the same investment of care and attention as anyone anywhere, and that the return on that investment, though it could not always be counted, was the entire point of human civilization. She had not been wrong. The school, the town, the valley, the specific lives of Thomas and Sarah, and the dozens of others who had passed through the schoolroom, all of it argued against wrongness. And here at the table, her husband and her children and the borrowed kitten on the borrowed porch of the life she had built, argued it even more convincingly. In 1890, the school received a letter from a regional education committee that was surveying frontier schools for a report it was preparing for the Texas state legislature. The committee wanted to document schools that had been established without public funding, that had operated for extended periods, and that could demonstrate educational outcomes. Alma's school, 10 years old by then, now a proper public institution, but with a decade of free tuition history behind it, was specifically named in the letter as a school of particular interest. A committee member came in November, a man named Dr. Aldridge from Austin, precise and bespectacled, who spent 3 days observing the school and interviewing Alma and reviewing the record she had kept meticulously for a decade. He interviewed some of the former students who were still in the area, Thomas, who was now 20, working on a cattle operation and able to read and write fluently, Sarah, who was running her own school, several others who had passed through and who spoke about the experience with a specificity that went beyond courtesy. On the 3rd day, Dr. Aldridge sat with Alma at the table that had been her original lesson table. She had kept it, used it still, and said, Mrs. Ralston, what made you do this? Start this school, sustain it for a decade, all without any institutional support. Alma considered the question carefully, the way she considered all questions. Then she said, I believe the children in this town deserved what children everywhere deserve, an education, and there was no one else here to give it to them. Many would have waited for someone else, Aldridge said. I know, she said. I did not see the point in waiting. He wrote something in his notebook. Then he looked up. The report will recommend your school as a model for other frontier communities. I hope that is acceptable. Only if the model includes the part about doing it for free until the resources arrive, she said, because that is the part that matters. The report was published in 1891 and included a detailed account of the Harlan Creek school, though Alma read it only once and then set it on the shelf and went back to the work, because the documentation of things was never as interesting to her as the things themselves. James was 12 in 1892 and already taller than the doorframe of his first classroom, reading at a level that required Calvin to order books from Austin because the local supply was exhausted. Henry was 9 and had decided, with the deliberate certainty of a child who has known his own mind from the beginning, that he was going to be a rancher, and Calvin was quietly proud of this in a way that he tried not to express too forcefully, because he did not want to create a pressure around a decision that should remain free. Clara was 7 and ferocious in the classroom and on the schoolyard, equally interested in books and in the small animals she collected from the creek and brought home in her pockets, which her mother had stopped objecting to after the 3rd year. The family was whole. The ranch was sound. The school was flourishing. The association was functioning. The valley was, on balance, a better place than it had been in 1878, and the specific, incremental reasons for this were not lost on the people who lived there. On a Saturday evening in the summer of 1892, Calvin and Alma sat on the porch of their house in the last light, the children inside doing whatever children do on Saturday evenings, the plains spreading out in every direction in the long grass and the long gold, the sky enormous overhead. He had his reading, a newspaper from Austin 2 weeks old, the way newspapers arrived, and she had her mending, and they were comfortable in the specific silence of two people who have shared a life long enough that silence is itself a form of conversation. He put the paper down after a while and looked at the land. "I have been thinking," he said. "About what?" she asked, without looking up from the mending. "The breeding operation. I want to bring in a bull from the east, a proper breeding bull, not a longhorn. The market is shifting. People want different beef." "How much?" she asked. "More than we have immediately available. Less than we have in 3 months' time." He paused. "I want to talk to Davis about a short loan, legal and documented." She looked up. "That is sensible. I thought you would say so." He picked the paper back up, then set it down again. "Also," he said. "Also," she prompted. "James," he said, "he needs more than this school can give him, not because the school is insufficient, it is remarkable, but because he has gone through everything it offers. I want to talk about what comes next." She was quiet for a moment. "Fort Worth," she said. "There is a school there, and if he does well, there are colleges further east." "I do not want to lose him east," Calvin said, and there was something in his voice that was careful and honest. "You will not lose him," she said. "That is not how it works, you know that." He looked at her. She was looking at him with the steady, undeceived expression that had made him fall in love with her in the first place, all those years ago in the old livery with chalk on her hands and fractions on the slate board. "I know," he said. "He will come back," she said, "and he will be more when he does. That is what we want for him." He nodded, looked at the land again. "Yes," he said. James went to Fort Worth in 1893, at 13, to a secondary school that took boarding students, and the drive to the railroad was the hardest single morning of Calvin's adult life, though he kept his face very steady. Alma cried on the way home, in the wagon with Calvin driving, and he put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned against him, and they drove home across the plains in the long afternoon, and did not try to make any of it smaller than it was. James wrote letters. They were good letters, detailed and specific, the letters of a person who had learned to write from a teacher who cared about language, and Alma read them at the table and Calvin read them after her, and they talked about what was in them the way they talked about everything, directly, with genuine interest, with respect for the person James was becoming. Henry grew into the ranch with the same slow, steady purpose he brought to everything. By the time he was 15, He was doing a man's work alongside Raphael and taking genuine satisfaction in it, and Calvin began to trust him with increasing responsibility, which Henry bore without displaying any pride about it, which made the trust more warranted. Clara, at 10, had her mother's composure and her father's intensity, and she was going to be interesting in ways that neither of her parents could fully predict yet, which was the most exciting thing about her. In 1895, on a spring afternoon that smelled of the rain that had come through the night before and left the grass bright and the air clean, Alma stood in the doorway of the Harlan Creek schoolhouse, the real one, the one with the bell tower, and watched 17 years of children in her mind, the way memory sometimes does things like that, laying the past over the present until you can see them simultaneously. Thomas, reading without stuttering. Sarah, asking her fierce questions. The 9 other years of children after them, all the names and faces and the specific moments of understanding that she had been privileged to witness. A child's face when a word clicks, when the numbers balance, when the story makes sense. She heard hoofbeats and looked up. Calvin was riding across from the ranch on Drum's successor. Drum had lived to a remarkable old age and had been retired with great comfort, a gray horse they called River, because James had named him when he was 4, and the name stuck. Calvin rode with the same ease he had always ridden, unhurried and certain, and he came up to the school and dismounted and tied River to the rail, the same post, though the rail had been replaced twice, and came to stand beside her in the doorway. He looked at the schoolroom. 17 years, she said. 17 years, he agreed. I started with 4 students, she said. I have had, she counted briefly in the way she counted things, over 200 children pass through this room. In some form. And 1 rancher, he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the schoolroom with the expression she knew, the quiet, deep attention he brought to things he valued. He was 52 now, and the gray was significant in his hair, and in the several days of growth he always seemed to have, and the lines around his eyes and at the corners of his mouth were the lines of someone who had spent 20 years mostly outdoors and mostly paying attention, and she found him more beautiful than she had at 35, which was a thing she had heard older women say and had not understood until she understood it herself. The rancher was my best student, she said. He looked at her then. The rancher disputes that, he said. I think Sarah holds that title. Sarah learned to be Sarah here, Alma said. You learned to read here. These are different kinds of achievement. Sarah's was harder. They were equal in importance, she said firmly, the way she said things that were not up for revision. Everything that happened in this room was of equal importance. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, yes, you are right. I know, she said, without arrogance, simply, factually. He put his arm around her and she put her arm around his waist, and they stood in the doorway of the school she had built, while the afternoon light fell across the plank floor and the rows of desks and the slate board at the front, and the bell tower above them was silent in the clean post-rain air, and Harlan Creek moved around them in the sounds of a Thursday afternoon. A wagon on the main street, a dog somewhere, children's voices from the direction of Brower's granddaughter's house, someone hammering. Everything was present and resolved and whole. The debts had been paid, the threats had been seen off, the land was protected and the children were taught, and the love that had begun across a lesson table in the winter of 1878 was deeper and more intricate and more daily than anything that had been possible to imagine from that beginning. Alma Hurst had nailed a piece of paper to a wall and said that anyone who wanted to learn was welcome. Calvin Ralston had walked through the door with his hat in his hands and said he wanted to learn to read. Both of those things were true, and both of those things were the beginning, and everything that came after was the story of 2 people who chose each other, deliberately and repeatedly, through all the years and seasons and difficulties and ordinary magnificent days that a life contains. Come home, he said after a while. She pulled the school door closed, the wood worn smooth at the handle from 1,000 morning openings. Yes, she said. She took his arm and they walked together to where River was tied, and he helped her up onto the horse's back. She had learned to ride properly eventually, though she would never love it the way he did, and then he swung up behind her, and they rode home across the valley in the spring afternoon, with the grass bright and the sky enormous and everything exactly as it should be. Behind them, the bell of the Harlan Creek schoolhouse was still. But in the morning it would ring, the way it rang every morning, and the children would come running across the dust from every direction, and a new day of learning would begin in the room that Alma Hurst had made from nothing, in the town that she had decided to love, in the life she had chosen and built and kept with both hands. The story did not end there. Of course, stories like this do not end. Exactly. Henry took over the ranch by degrees and ran it with the same quiet care his father had brought to it. James came back from the East with an engineering degree and a wife from San Antonio, and built a house on the eastern edge of the valley, and eventually helped extend the irrigation system that transformed what the valley could grow. Clara became, as it turned out, a doctor, one of the very few women doctors in Texas in the early years of the new century, and she set up a practice in Harlan Creek that served the valley with the same approach her mother had brought to the school: for free when necessary, for what people could pay when they could pay it always. Sarah, who had started her school in the neighboring settlement, went on to help establish 3 more schools in the region over the following years. She wrote to Alma twice a year, every year, for the rest of both their lives. Thomas worked cattle until he was 40 and then bought a small piece of land and ran it himself and read to his children every evening, every word clear and unhurried. And Calvin and Alma grew old on the plains of the Llano Estacado, in the house on the ranch that Calvin had built, and that had been added to and improved and changed over the years, until it was a real house, solid and particular, full of books and children and grandchildren, and the smell of coffee and the sound of wind, and the specific quality of light that the Texas sky produces in the evening, which is unlike any other light in any other place on earth. He read to her in the evenings of their old age, when her eyes had grown tired, sat beside her in the lamp light, and read aloud from whatever book they were in the middle of, his voice still calm and unhurried, the voice of a man who had learned the habit in the winter of his life and made it part of his character. She listened the way she listened to everything fully, with her whole attention, and occasionally she corrected his pronunciation, gently, and he accepted the correction the way he always had, without ego, as simply information. This was how the quiet widow who taught school for free and the rancher who came to learn spent their days teaching each other, protecting each other, building something together that was more than either of them could have built alone, in a valley on the edge of the Llano Estacado, in the last and best years of the wild Texas frontier. And every morning, for as long as Alma drew breath, the bell of the Harlan Creek schoolhouse rang.